All right, let's set the scene. Imagine it's April 1970. You are sitting inside a tiny metal capsule, a staggering 330,000 kilometers away from Earth, coasting smoothly and quietly toward the moon. Everything is so incredibly routine, so quiet, in fact, that the flight controllers back home are literally complaining about being bored to tears. And then, bam, a massive, violent explosion completely rocks your spacecraft. Alarms are shrieking, warning lights are painting the entire cabin red. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to completely dissect one of the most harrowing survival stories in human history, the Apollo 13 mission. We'll look at exactly how a crazy chain reaction of tiny engineering oversights turned a routine lunar landing into a desperate fight for survival, and how sheer human ingenuity brought 3 men back from the absolute brink. Let's get into it.
Houston, we've had a problem here. Just hearing that famous transmission from Commander Jim Lovell gives you chills, right? It instantly transformed seemingly routine flight into a full-blown crisis. Now, at first, Mission Control on the ground couldn't even believe it. They actually assumed the instruments were just glitching out. But up in space, the astronauts could look out their window and physically see their precious, life-sustaining gases just venting right out into the dark vacuum of space. They were literally bleeding out. And the force of that blast was actually shifting them off their trajectory, pushing them kilometers farther away from Earth with every passing second. So, to really understand what broke here, we need to quickly visualize what they were flying in. The spacecraft essentially had 3 main chunks. First, you've got your command module. This is the tiny cone-shaped cabin, only 11 feet long, by the way, where the 3 astronauts sat. It held all their navigation gear and life support. Second, attached right to it, is the service module. Think of this as the workhorse. It housed their main engine, fuel cells for electricity, and, crucially, their main oxygen tanks. And finally, there's the lunar module, which was a highly specialized craft designed exclusively to detach, land on the moon, and return to the main ship. To comprehend the nightmare they were about to face, we've really got to focus on that middle piece, the service module.
Okay, Section 1, Anatomy of the Explosion, Why Tank 2 Failed.
It is absolutely wild how a catastrophe of this scale can trace back to a single, minor oopsie moment. Get this. Tank 2 was originally installed in the Apollo 10 spacecraft. During prep for that mission, it was removed for a quick modification and accidentally dropped. Just a minor drop, right? Well, that drop slightly damaged an internal tube, and nobody noticed. Later, during testing, this damaged tube prevented the tank from emptying properly. So to get rid of the remaining liquid oxygen, engineers decided to just use the tank's internal heater to boil it off. Sound logic, but here is where the fatal flaw happens. Because of a mismatch in equipment limits, the intense heat secretly melted the Teflon insulation right off the electrical wires inside that tank. So, flash forward 2 days into the Apollo 13 mission. Mission Control asks astronaut Jack Swigert to perform a totally routine stirring of the oxygen tanks. He flips the switch, electricity surges through those newly bare wires, and a spark ignites in an environment packed with pure, highly pressurized oxygen. Now, you might be wondering, how on earth did they not know the tank was overheating when they boiled off the oxygen on the ground? Well, because the thermometer inside that tank was only designed to register up to 30 degrees Celsius, it simply maxed out and pegged at the top. But inside, the actual temperature had surged to a staggering 538 degrees Celsius. Talk about a massive blind spot. The tank passed all the thorough pre-flight investigations by NASA engineers simply because the damage was entirely internal. It was hidden away like a ticking time bomb, just waiting for a routine flip of a switch in deep space. Boom! The spark hits, and the immediate aftermath is just brutal. One oxygen tank is instantly empty. The second one is leaking rapidly. The blast was so unbelievably powerful that it blew a massive 13-foot panel completely off the side of the spacecraft. Honestly, it was pure luck that the tanks were attached to the exterior of the craft, because if they had been inside the cabin, the crew would have been killed instantly. But now, they had a terrifying choice to make. The fastest way home was to turn around and fire the service module's main engine, but that engine was sitting right next to the blast zone. If it was damaged at all, firing it could blow the entire ship apart. They just couldn't risk it. They had to take the long, harrowing way around the moon.
Which brings us to Section 2, the lunar lifeboat, desperate measures. So the command module is dying fast. The crew is forced to power it down and move into the lunar module to use it as an emergency lifeboat. And when you look at the math here, the sheer impossibility of their situation becomes pretty clear. The intended design of the lunar module was to keep just 2 astronauts alive for roughly 20 hours while they landed on the moon. The reality they were facing? It now had to keep 3 grown men alive for 4 to 5 entire days as they literally slingshotted around the far side of the moon to get back to Earth.
And while they're executing this desperate maneuver, coasting around the dark side of the moon, they actually hit a distance of 400,000 kilometers from Earth. That wasn't just terrifying, it was a literal record. To this day, no human beings have ever been further from our home planet than the crew of Apollo 13 were right then, sitting in that freezing, cramped, crippled little lifeboat.
But here's the real kicker. Distance wasn't their only enemy. Their own breath was literally poisoning them. You see, when you breathe in oxygen, you breathe out carbon dioxide, right? Spaceships use lithium hydroxide canisters to scrub that CO2 from the air. The problem was, the lunar module only had enough of these canisters for 2 guys for 2 days. So the carbon dioxide levels are rising fast, creating a dire, lethal emergency. Now, there were plenty of spare canisters over in the dead command module, but there was an infuriating engineering oversight. The command module filters were square. The holes in the lunar module's system were circular. It was literally a square peg in a round hole life or death situation. You can't make this stuff up.
Mission Control had exactly 24 hours to solve this before the crew suffocated. They had the astronauts read out literally everything they had on board: plastic bags, cardboard, spacesuit hoses, some duct tape. Through sheer genius, engineers on the ground rigged together a makeshift adapter, tested it, and read the step-by-step instructions up to the crew. As Commander Lovell later put it in his book, the contraption wasn't very handsome, but it worked. The carbon dioxide levels dropped. They could finally breathe again.
Moving right along to Section 3, Engineering or Rescue. Ticking clocks. Okay, so even with the air cleared up, the clock was absolutely not their friend. On their current path, they wouldn't reach Earth until 153 hours after launch. Ground calculations showed that at 153 hours, they would only have a razor-thin 1-hour surplus of food, water, and oxygen. That margin was way too tight for NASA. So they decided on an incredibly risky maneuver. They fired the lunar module's engine for a second time. This engine was not designed for repeated burns, but thankfully, the calculations proved correct. The burn shaved their flight time down to 143 hours, buying them an absolutely crucial 10-hour margin of survival.
And speaking of tight margins, 200 milliliters. To put that into perspective, that's less than a standard cup of coffee. That was the absolute maximum amount of water each astronaut was allowed to drink per day. Why so insanely little? Well, not just because they were running out of water, but for a frankly bizarre physics reason. If they drank more water, they would need to urinate more. And in space, venting urine out of the spacecraft actually produces a tiny bit of thrust. The engineers realized that venting normal amounts of urine could literally alter the precise trajectory of the spaceship and throw them completely off course for Earth re-entry.
You can imagine the physical tool here. To survive, they had shut down almost all electrical systems, including the heaters. It was freezing cold in there. Between the intense stress, the bitter cold, and the extreme dehydration, the guys were suffering immensely. Across the 3 crew members, they lost a total of 14 kilograms of body weight. And because of the severe water rationing and lack of hygiene, astronaut Fred Hayes actually developed a severe urinary tract infection. They were exhausted and pushed to their absolute biological limits, just trying to hold on until they reached Earth's atmosphere. Almost home. Section 4, the final hurdle, re-entry blackout. So to actually survive re-entry, the crew had to leave their trusty lifeboat and crawl back into the freezing, dead command module, because it's the only part with a heat shield. As they slammed into the atmosphere, the extreme heat ionized the air around them, which creates a normal radio blackout. Usually, this lasts about 2 to 3 minutes. The whole world was watching on TV, holding their breath. 3 minutes pass. Nothing. 30 more seconds. Silence. 4 minutes go by. People were really starting to fear the worst. Had the explosion damaged the heat shield? Did they burn up? Finally, at an agonizing 4 minutes and 27 seconds, communication was restored. The parachutes deployed. They were alive. Splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. They actually made it. Now, Apollo 13 obviously never landed on the moon, so in that regard, the primary mission was a failure. But it went down in history as a successful failure. The rigorous investigation that followed led to intense safety overhauls, entirely redesigning how NASA handled oxygen storage and wiring from the ground up. The teamwork, the leadership, and the out-of-the-box problem-solving essentially paved the way for the total, flawless success of Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17. Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder.
When you really look at the sheer ingenuity required to overcome those impossible odds and the massive safety improvements that protected every single astronaut who followed, could the terrifying failure of Apollo 13 actually be NASA's greatest, most vital success? It's an incredible testament to human resilience and teamwork under pressure. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning and keep learning.